Amy and I met when life felt infinite. College was a mess of deadlines, wild nights, and spontaneous road trips. She was studying journalism, determined and fierce, while I was buried in engineering books, trying to keep up with the shifting tides of academia. We clicked over coffee runs and late-night study sessions, and the connection was immediate and magnetic. Our shared ambitions carried us through graduation and into a whirlwind of job hunts and apartment leases. By our late 20s, we were married, carving out a life in the city we had fallen in love with. The years together were marked by routine, morning coffees on the balcony, shared playlists, inside jokes that could split our sides with laughter. Friends would say, "You two are made for each other," and I believed it. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, until it wasn't. Amy's career as a journalist had always been a point of pride, both for her and for me. She thrived in her role, chasing stories with the kind of zeal that made her stand out. Her byline appeared in prominent publications, earning her recognition that made the long nights worthwhile. But as her career evolved, so did the demands. What once were occasional late nights turned into regular absences, work trips, and unexplained hours. The changes happened so gradually that I didn't notice the shift from excitement to detachment. One Friday night, she came home late again. I had cooked dinner, pasta with her favorite homemade pesto, and the plates sat cold on the table. She walked in, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, eyes tired but wired with a strange energy. "Hey," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though the disappointment was palpable. "Yeah, sorry. The story I'm working on is taking longer than I thought." She set her bag down and kissed me absent-mindedly before disappearing into the bathroom. I stared at the untouched plates and poured myself another glass of wine. The unease that had been creeping at the edges of my mind flared into something sharper. It wasn't just tonight. It was the string of nights where our conversations had thinned to mundane exchanges, and moments of silence filled the spaces where laughter used to be. Weeks turned into months, each one marked by more late nights and brief distracted phone calls. The distance grew, creeping between us like ivy, resilient and unwelcome. The turning point came one morning when I grabbed her laptop to help her set up a new browser tab for an article she'd been talking about. The page was already open, but it wasn't her usual news outlet or research notes. It was a series of emails, one in particular, standing out with the subject line, "Last night." I hesitated, my breath catching in my chest. The cursor hovered over the email, and the rational part of me screamed to shut it and walk away. But the gnawing doubt that had eaten at me for months won out. I clicked. The words were a dagger. It was written in the familiar tone of intimacy, recounting memories only shared by two people who weren't colleagues. Tom had written about a night they'd spent walking through the city, wrapped in conversation until the early hours. He mentioned her laughter, how it echoed in his mind long after they parted. It read like a confession, each sentence sharper than the last. I closed the laptop and sat in stunned silence, my pulse roaring in my ears. The room felt like it was collapsing around me, the edges darkening with the weight of what I had just discovered. That evening, Amy came home, the scent of her perfume wafting through the door as she walked in. I watched her unpack, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The silence between us was suffocating, stretching out as she moved around the room, unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. "Did you get my text about dinner?" she asked, rummaging through her purse. I didn't answer. When she turned to look at me, my eyes met hers, and whatever smile she'd been wearing faltered. "What's wrong?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know about Tom," I said, each word falling heavy in the room. Her face changed in an instant, the blood draining away as if I'd struck her. "What are you talking about?" The question was defensive, but her voice shook. "I saw the emails, Amy. Don't lie to me," I said. the tightness in my chest making it hard to breathe. Her mouth opened, then closed again as she searched for words. The silence stretched unbearably until finally she sat down on the couch, head in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, and my world shattered. The confessions came in bursts, painful and stuttering. It had started a year ago, during an overseas assignment where they worked on the same story. It began innocently enough: long hours, shared frustrations, and drinks at the end of exhausting days. Lines blurred in the isolation of hotel bars and unfamiliar cities. What started as camaraderie turned into something else when the job ended and they didn't. Amy admitted it wasn't just one night. It had grown into a secret part of her life, tucked away in stolen moments and whispered conversations. The weight of her words pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. It was the only word I could manage. "I don't know," she said, her eyes red and glistening. "I felt trapped, disconnected. He was just there." The words stung like an open wound, but beneath the anger, a colder realization took hold. We had drifted apart long before Tom ever entered the picture. The betrayal was hers, but the cracks in our foundation had been forming for longer than I cared to admit. Days turned into weeks of tension, so thick you could cut it. Amy moved into the spare room, each night punctuated by the sound of a door closing that might as well have been a gunshot. We tried therapy, a desperate attempt to salvage the wreckage. In the sessions, we picked apart the moments we missed: late-night phone calls unanswered, the way we sat in separate rooms even when we were home. Amy spoke of her guilt, how it gnawed at her during the day and kept her awake at night. She said she wanted to rebuild, to find her way back to us. I sat across from her, listening, but the trust that had defined us was shattered, scattered like shards of glass. Every time her phone buzzed, I flinched. Every night she spent out for work was a battle between paranoia and reluctant trust. The most painful part was the ordinary moments that hadn't changed, the way she hummed when she cooked or the half-smile she gave when lost in thought. Those fragments of the woman I loved coexisted with the one who had lied, creating a fracture that seemed impossible to mend. After the initial confrontation, life felt surreal, like stepping into a world I didn't recognize. We agreed to try to piece together something that resembled what we had, but each day was a seesaw of doubt and strained hope. Amy and I moved in a forced rhythm, going through motions that felt mechanical, hollow. Conversations felt scripted, our laughter rehearsed and brittle. We'd discuss mundane things like groceries and work schedules, but the topics we avoided screamed louder than our words. Therapy was our weekly ritual, a place to air grievances and speak truths we couldn't say at home. The therapist's office was dimly lit, with framed motivational quotes and a neutral scent that failed to mask the tension. Amy sat across from me, fidgeting with her wedding ring, an action that used to bring me comfort, but now made me question its meaning. One evening, the therapist asked, "What do you need from each other to heal?" I stared at the floor, the patterns in the carpet suddenly fascinating. Amy whispered, "Forgiveness," so quietly I almost missed it. The word lodged in my throat like a jagged stone. I wanted to say trust, but that felt impossible to request when I didn't know if I could offer it back. One weekend, a mutual friend, Ben, came over. He didn't know the full story, just that Amy and I were going through something. As we sat around the patio, sipping beers, he noticed the distance, the absence of shared jokes and casual touches. "So, how's life treating you too?" he asked, his eyes darting between us. Amy shifted uncomfortably, and I forced a smile that felt like a grimace. "Busy," I replied. Amy's phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a notification. She reached for it quickly, and a tension crackled in the air. Ben raised an eyebrow, but he didn't push. The conversation limped on, stilted and full of empty words. After he left, Amy and I sat in silence, the unspoken truth lying between us like a coiled snake. "Do they know?" I finally asked. She shook her head, eyes focused somewhere far away. "Number. And I'd like to keep it that way, for now." I nodded, but a bitter thought ran through my mind. Keeping secrets was her specialty. Amy's guilt manifested in small, poignant ways. An extra effort to cook my favorite meals, surprise tickets to a concert, a tearful "I'm sorry" whispered in the dark when she thought I was asleep. Each gesture was a knife twist. I appreciated them, but they were salt in a wound that hadn't begun to heal. I started avoiding home, throwing myself into work and finding excuses to stay out late. When I did come back, the house was stifling. We slept in the same bed but might as well have been miles apart. The memories of shared mornings, laughing as we jostled for space at the bathroom sink, felt like they belonged to strangers. Then, one evening, I found an old photo album while cleaning out the closet. It was filled with pictures from trips, birthdays, and lazy Sundays, moments so filled with love that I felt a physical ache looking at them. Amy walked in as I was flipping through the pages, her eyes catching on a picture of us at a beach, sunburned and grinning. "Remember that," she said softly, her voice catching. I nodded, unable to look at her. "Yeah, before all this." The silence that followed was unbearable, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she sat next to me, close but not touching, both of us staring at a version of us that felt unreachable. The fragile truth shattered one night when I got a message from a coworker who'd seen Amy at a bar with a group of people, including Tom. The room spun as I read the text, my body flooding with cold rage. I called her immediately. "Where are you?" I asked, voice shaking. "Still at work. Why?" Her tone was casual, but the lie was clear. I hung up, grabbed my keys, and drove to the bar. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, I spotted her instantly. She was sitting at a corner table, talking animatedly with Tom. They weren't touching, but the familiarity in their body language was unmistakable. Our eyes met, and her smile dropped, replaced by an expression of dread. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What are you doing here?" she stammered. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice low but laced with venom. Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. "I think I should go," he mumbled, grabbing his coat. The coward left without meeting my eyes. Amy and I stood there, the noise of the bar fading into a dull roar. "I wasn't," she started, but I cut her off. "Save it," I said. "I'm done." The ride home was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. When we got inside, the argument exploded. Words I didn't know I had in me spilled out, fueled by months of suspicion, betrayal, and exhaustion. Amy yelled back, defending, explaining, apologizing all at once. But it didn't matter. The trust that had been frayed beyond recognition finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice hollow. The declaration hung in the air, final and unyielding. The following days were a blur of silence and solitude. Amy and I coexisted like two ships passing in the night, our interactions reduced to necessary exchanges about bills and logistics. I moved into the spare room, and the house felt like a museum filled with memories that cut deeper than any knife. Each photograph, each piece of furniture seemed to echo our shared past, a painful reminder of what had been lost. Despite the emotional turmoil, I found myself grappling with an unexpected sense of relief. Finally, acknowledging the fractures in our relationship felt like lifting a heavy weight off my chest. I spent late nights with friends, drowning in beers and laughter, trying to drown out the emptiness that filled my days. I started running again, using the rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement to clear my mind. The physical exertion became a cathartic release, a way to push back against the anger and betrayal that threatened to consume me. After a week of navigating this new reality, I reluctantly agreed to return to therapy, alone this time. I walked into the office, my emotions a tangled mess. I wasn't sure what to expect. I had spent so long hiding my pain, trying to salvage our marriage, that I hadn't considered my own needs. "Why are you here today?" the therapist asked, her voice calm and inviting. "To figure out how to move on," I said, the words feeling strange and foreign. It was as if I were confessing a truth I had buried deep. "And what does moving on look like for you?" she probed. "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "I feel so angry, and I don't want to be this way, but I can't just forget what happened." She nodded, encouraging me to explore those feelings. I talked about the weight of betrayal, the anger, and the resentment that bubbled beneath the surface. I also spoke of the fond memories of Amy, the woman I had loved fiercely. The contradiction swirled around in my mind: love and anger, trust and betrayal. How could I reconcile those two opposing forces? About a month after the confrontation at the bar, I was at the local coffee shop, buried in my laptop and a fresh manuscript for a work project. My fingers flew over the keys as I tried to drown out the chaos of my thoughts. Then I heard a familiar voice. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see Amy standing there, her hair pulled back and eyes shadowed with uncertainty. It had been weeks since we'd had a conversation that wasn't about logistics or bills. "Sure," I replied, my heart racing at the unexpectedness of the encounter. We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, and I could see the hesitation in her movements. Finally, she broke the silence. "I miss you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I miss the way things were," I replied, but it felt like I was speaking through a fog. I wanted to scream, to let all my frustration out, but instead I was met with a heavy quiet. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her gaze steadying. "About us and about everything I did. I know I messed up, I want a chance to explain, to show you that I'm trying to change." I took a deep breath, my emotions swirling as I considered her words. Part of me was angry at the audacity, yet another part felt a flicker of hope. "You've said that before," I replied cautiously. "How can I trust that this isn't just another empty promise?" "I know," she replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "I can't change the past, but I want to prove to you that I'm committed to making this work. I'm going to therapy too. I'm trying to understand why I did what I did." I let her words hang in the air. It wasn't easy to dismiss the anger, but I couldn't help but see a glimmer of sincerity in her eyes. "Okay," I said finally, "but it's going to take time. Trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight." Over the next few months, we started to navigate a tentative path back to each other. It wasn't smooth sailing. There were arguments and moments of doubt, but there were also glimpses of the connection we once shared. We started having regular coffee dates, reminiscing about the past while carefully avoiding the elephant in the room. There were moments of laughter that felt genuine, moments where I felt like the weight of betrayal lifted, even if just for a little while. We agreed to attend couples therapy together. It became a safe space for both of us to express our fears, doubts, and dreams. In those sessions, we began to unpack the intricacies of our relationship, including how I had been so consumed by my own work that I had neglected our emotional intimacy. Amy's confessions of loneliness during her long work hours opened my eyes to the ways we had drifted apart long before Tom entered the picture. One evening, during a particularly impactful session, Amy said something that stuck with me. "I felt like I lost myself in the process of trying to be everything for everyone, including you. I thought I was being strong, but it only led me to make terrible choices." Hearing her admit that was heartbreaking, yet enlightening. It was a moment of clarity, one that underscored the need for both of us to not only heal, but to grow individually. As the months passed, I noticed a shift in our dynamic. We began to rebuild trust through small, intentional acts. Amy worked hard to communicate her feelings, and I made a concerted effort to be present, to listen, and to validate her experiences. We started planning short trips together, reigniting the sense of adventure we once had. One weekend, we decided to go hiking in the nearby national park. The fresh air and breathtaking views made it easier to forget our struggles, if only for a moment. As we sat on a rock overlooking a vast valley, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. "I want to trust you again," I said, gazing out at the horizon, "but it's hard to shake the feeling of betrayal." "I know," she replied, her voice steady, "but I'm here, and I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to earn that trust back." We spent the afternoon talking, sharing fears, hopes, and dreams. It felt like a small step toward something bigger, a potential for healing that seemed attainable. As we hiked back down, hand in hand, it struck me how far we'd come. There was still a long road ahead, but maybe we could navigate it together. Time marched on, and while we had made significant progress, there were still moments of uncertainty. One day, I stumbled upon an article online about infidelity and its long-term effects on relationships. As I read through it, I felt the familiar pang of betrayal. I shared it with Amy that evening. "It's scary to think about how deep those scars can run," I said, feeling vulnerable. "I know," she said softly, reaching for my hand. But every relationship is different. We're not defined by my mistakes. We can redefine ourselves together." Her words hung in the air, full of hope and challenge. I wanted to believe her, but the specter of her infidelity still loomed large. Then, one night, I had a nightmare that jolted me awake. In it, I saw Amy with Tom, laughing and happy, and I felt the familiar rush of betrayal and anger. When I woke up, I felt the cold sweat on my brow, the same feelings from months ago flooding back. It was as if our progress was fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. The next morning, I brought it up. "I had a nightmare about you and Tom," I admitted, bracing myself for her reaction. "I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes wide with concern. "I can't imagine how hard this is for you." "It is," I replied, the vulnerability stripping me of my defenses. "I thought we were moving forward, but it's like I'm still stuck." She leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll keep working through this together. I love you." Those words resonated deep within me. Love had become a complex web of emotions, but hearing her say it reminded me of the foundation we had built. Perhaps love, like trust, could be rebuilt if both of us were committed to the effort. Months turned into a year since the revelation of Amy's affair, and while the scars remained, they were no longer open wounds. We learned to navigate our life together with a new understanding of each other's vulnerabilities. Trust wasn't fully restored, but it was no longer the fragile thing it had once been. Instead, it transformed into something more resilient. We learned to celebrate small victories. Our first anniversary, post-revelation, was spent in a cozy cabin by the lake, reminiscing about old memories and creating new ones. The laughter came more easily now, and we found joy in the mundane moments that had once been overshadowed by betrayal. As we stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that life wasn't about erasing the past, but about learning from it. The road had been rocky, filled with challenges, but through it all, we had forged a new connection, one built on honesty and vulnerability. We weren't the same couple we had been before, but perhaps that was the point. We had emerged from the storm, changed but together, ready to face whatever the future held. In the end, it wasn't just about healing from infidelity. It was about discovering the strength within ourselves and each other to overcome the odds. And that, in itself, was a victory worth celebrating. The summer of our 5th wedding anniversary came with the promise of sun, sand, and relaxation. Amy and I had planned this trip to Cancun for months. After years of work and responsibility, we finally decided to invest in some quality time together, away from the chaos of daily life. I could already picture us lounging on the beach, sipping cocktails, and reconnecting. We arrived in Cancun, and everything felt perfect. The resort was stunning, nestled right along the coast, with palm trees swaying gently in the warm breeze. Amy was radiant, her laughter infectious as we explored the sprawling grounds. Our first few days were filled with bliss, snorkeling in crystal-clear waters, romantic dinners under the stars, and long walks along the beach at sunset. It felt like the perfect escape. On the third night, we attended a themed beach party at the resort. The music was vibrant, the energy electric. I watched as Amy danced, her spirit unrestrained, a smile illuminating her face. The atmosphere was intoxicating, and I lost myself in the rhythm of the night, feeling grateful for the moments we were creating together. But then I noticed him, a tall, athletic guy, with an accent I couldn't quite place. He was charming, mingling with guests, and when he approached our group, I felt a flicker of unease. He had that magnetic energy that drew people in, and Amy was one of them. As the night wore on, I caught snippets of their conversation, laughter mingling in the air. Just a friendly flirtation, I told myself, trying to suppress the nagging feeling in my gut. After all, we were on vacation, and this was meant to be fun. As the days rolled on, I noticed a subtle shift in Amy. She began spending more time with him, often justifying it as harmless fun. I could see the spark in her eyes when she talked about their interactions, the way her laughter flowed a little too easily. My initial concerns grew into anxiety, but I tried to push them aside. We were in paradise, and I didn't want to ruin our time together with my paranoia. One evening, I planned a surprise dinner at a beachfront restaurant, hoping to rekindle the romantic connection we once had. I wanted to remind her of the love we shared. As I waited for her to get ready, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the moment we needed to reset. But when she walked into the restaurant, her eyes sparkled in a way that felt foreign. She had just come from a quick chat with the guy. I could smell the alcohol on her breath, and the slight flush in her cheeks screamed too much fun. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, just talking to him. He's really interesting," she replied, her excitement almost palpable. "Interesting enough to miss our dinner?" I shot back, unable to mask my frustration. She hesitated, the realization dawning on her that she might have crossed a line. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel bad. Let's just enjoy tonight." But the dinner felt off. We forced smiles, our conversation strained. My heart raced as I tried to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The tension simmered under the surface, but I didn't want to ruin our trip over a guy I didn't trust. The following day, I decided to confront the issue head-on. I found Amy sunbathing by the pool, her laughter ringing out as she chatted with a few other guests. I approached her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Amy, can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady but filled with urgency. "Sure, what's up?" she replied, her tone casual, but I could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "I don't like how close you've gotten with that guy. It feels like it's crossing a line, and it's making me uncomfortable." Her face dropped for a moment before she recovered. "Come on, it's just harmless fun. You're overreacting." "Am I?" I pressed. "It doesn't feel harmless to me. It feels like you're choosing him over me." She opened her mouth to respond, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. Just then, he approached, slinging his arm casually around her shoulder. "Hey, beautiful, you ready for another round of drinks?" I felt my blood boil as he leaned in closer to her, too familiar for my comfort. "Actually, we were just having a private conversation," I said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. He smirked, seemingly unfazed, and retreated. Amy looked at me, her expression a mix of annoyance and confusion. "That was unnecessary," she said sharply. "Was it? You're treating this like it's just a game. But this is my marriage we're talking about." The conversation escalated, emotions running high. We ended up arguing loudly, drawing the attention of nearby vacationers. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed away, heart racing, leaving her to digest what I had said. As the sun set that night, I sat on our balcony, staring into the darkness. I wanted to trust her, to believe she wouldn't betray me, but every laugh, every shared glance with that guy felt like a dagger to my heart. The next morning, I found myself in a fog of uncertainty. I hadn't slept well, tossing and turning as thoughts of betrayal flooded my mind. Amy walked out onto the balcony, and I could see the apprehension in her eyes. "I want to talk," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "Okay," I replied, bracing myself for what was to come. "I know I've been distant," she started, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it was just a fling, a distraction. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I shot back, anger bubbling to the surface. "You were all over him. You laughed with him, shared drinks, everything. How can you say it didn't mean anything?" "I was trying to escape, to feel alive again. I didn't realize it would go that far. I swear, I didn't sleep with him, but I know that doesn't excuse my behavior." "Then why didn't you come to me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You were supposed to be my partner, my confidant. Instead, you chose him." Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know. I felt lost, like I was fading away. It was easier to connect with someone new than to confront the issues we've been ignoring." Her honesty struck me like a punch. "You're saying I'm to blame for this?" "No, that's not what I meant. I'm just trying to explain how I got there." We stood there in silence, the weight of her confession hanging heavily between us. It was an awful realization. While I had been planning romantic gestures, she had been seeking solace in the arms of someone else, regardless of whether it had crossed the physical line. The remainder of the trip was a blur. We avoided each other, the tension palpable. I wanted to salvage our vacation, but every time I looked at her, I felt sick. The betrayal tainted everything. On the last night, I couldn't take it any longer. We found ourselves alone at the beach, the moonlight casting a glow over the waves. "I need to know where we stand," I said, voice low. "I love you," she said desperately, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I made a mistake, and I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to make it right." "Anything?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Because I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I want to go back to our life after this." She reached for my hand, and I flinched. "Please, just give me a chance. Let's go home and work on this. We can fix it." I looked out at the ocean, the waves crashing against the shore. I wanted to believe her, but the reality of what she had done weighed heavily on me. "I need time to think," I finally said. "This isn't something that can just be brushed aside." When we returned home, the silence was deafening. We unpacked our bags, the souvenirs of our vacation, reminders of the cracks that had formed in our relationship. I felt like a stranger in my own house, wandering through the rooms that once felt warm and inviting. Weeks turned into months as we navigated this new reality. I sought therapy, grappling with feelings of betrayal and confusion. Meanwhile, Amy committed to her own therapy, determined to understand the root of her actions. The road to recovery was tumultuous. There were days filled with hope and connection, and others steeped in doubt and frustration. Each conversation felt like a minefield, where one wrong word could trigger a familiar hurt. Eventually, we reached a turning point when we decided to take a trip again. This time, it was a different destination, a quiet cabin in the woods, away from the noise of the world. As we hiked through the trees, I started to see glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with. We talked openly, sharing our fears and dreams. Slowly, the walls we had built began to crumble. Rebuilding trust was a painstaking process, one that required vulnerability and honesty. Amy made a conscious effort to reassure me of her commitment, her willingness to face the consequences of her actions. I learned to express my feelings without anger, to articulate my needs and desires openly. We began to reconnect through shared activities, from cooking together to exploring new hobbies. Each small step felt monumental. Eventually, we found ourselves laughing again, finding joy in the little moments. I realized that while the scars of the past remained, they were not insurmountable. Years later, as we celebrated our anniversary, I reflected on the journey we had taken. We weren't the same couple we had been before, but perhaps that was the point. We had emerged from the storm, changed but together, ready to face whatever the future held.